Well, you've reached the end of World Studies Honors Grasshoppers. This is it. This is the last content I will be giving you for the year. And once again, I am trying to get a couple of lessons worth into one because we're out of time. Let's make sure that we get our housekeeping straight. First things first, is that at the end of this module, you will see all of the journal entries that I expect you to have on a Google Doc that will be submitted to me by, 4 p.m. on May 15th, okay? Because school ends for us on May 19th. So I'm going to need the days to grade. So I would like as many of you as possible to get this thing submitted by May 15th, after you answer this last journal prompt that asks you to compare and contrast different regions of the world in terms of their decolonization process. The Middle East is the last region of the world that we have to take a look at. And my presentation for you today is a little bit different in that I'm using a PowerPoint and then, zooming you in on that, okay? So follow along with me here as I lay the groundwork for the modern problems that we see in the Middle East today in the decolonization process, and then watch the two embedded videos. Both videos total are 15 minutes or so. So watch those and then answer the final prompt that will ask you to compare the Middle East, Africa, and India in terms of the decolonization process, okay? Compare and contrast. You'll have plenty of information to talk about by the time you get to that point. So let's take a look. As we look at the Middle East, it's going to conjure up a lot of the stuff we talked about at the beginning of class during the religions unit, right? We've got major religions that all intersect, the monotheistic religions that all intersect in the Middle East, particularly around the city of Jerusalem. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all intersect in this region of the world. And while religion certainly plays a major role in what is going on there and what has happened since World War II with decolonization in the region, as the white people or Western powers have exited the Middle East in terms of domineering forces there, their imprint and influence is still all over the place, notably with respect to the resource of oil, but also in terms of religious aspects, because the United States, of course, today has open support for the Israelis, something that adds to the conflict between the Israelis and another group that live in what is now Israel, the Palestinians. So there are religious things going on here. There are resource things going on here. The Middle East was also a battleground along with the rest of the world during the Cold War with the Soviets. So you got to picture all that. But our story is going to go all the way back to the ending of World War I and self-determination. So that's where I'm going to start us. So you remember the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire used to be vast. This Muslim empire was just flourishing and dominant for a very long time. And you might remember that the Ottoman Turks, by the time we get to World War I, the Ottoman Turks decided to join the Central Powers as a means by which they could save what was left of their dwindling empire at that point. They ended up on the losing side, right? Peace out, Ottoman Empire. You joined the wrong side and you lost. And so the European politicians partitioned or divided up the Ottoman Empire and created what we called mandates, okay? And these were they're basically the beginning of the modern nation states of the Middle East as they exist now. And I want to remind you, as you take a look at this part of the slide, that these lines were drawn by white people. What does that remind you of? Think about our prompt, compare and contrast decolonization in different parts of the world. Where have we talked about partition before? Where have we talked about lines being drawn by white people before? So, and here we go, paid no attention to religious or ethnic groups living in these areas. Nationalism, that means, is a relatively new thing to this region of the world, because it's these countries are so young because they were drawn after World War I. So like when you talk about loyalty to your nation, like what are we really talking about? Now, there's Arab nationalism, all right? And to an extent, there's Persian nationalism, for those of you that don't know. A country like Iran, for an example, is not Arab, it's Persian. So like there's nationalism based on like ethnic identities, which we've seen before. And of course, you know there's gonna be a Moretti cheesy joke in here. Great Scott, Ingrid, it's the Ottoman Empire. Ha ha, Ottoman furniture, you get it? Like that's, you're laughing right now. That's a dad joke, you're laughing. And you also remember that in exchange for Arab help against the Ottoman Turks in World War I, Britain particularly had promised freedom, okay, to these Arab groups, the Arab Revolt, right? A promise that is quickly betrayed by the Sykes-Picot arrangement behind the scenes. Turkey was independent. So here is the product of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. The people living in these areas were supposed to get freedom, and instead what they got was mandate status. You might remember us talking about that. It's imperialism light. So these areas lived in these people that lived in these areas were really still under Western domination, Britain and France in particular. The now defunct League of Nations also administered some of this. But you can see over here in Jerusalem, which is a multi-religious and ethnic city, is going to be under international, meaning Western control, like the League of Nations, and particularly Britain. But this shows the breakdown. This is not what the people, particularly the Arabs living in the Middle East, were expecting. They were expecting freedom, self-determination. Instead, they got this. This kind of gives you another look at it, how it was broken down originally. So these are some of the modern nation states in the Middle East, and it shows you the dates of their independence. So you'll notice that a lot of these states became independent after World War II. Not all of them. Some of them had a path to independence before World War II, but certainly after World War I, all of them got their independence. And so these are relatively young nation states. So most of the identities built in them are not necessarily loyalty to the country the way we would think of it, like in the United States. It is loyalty to their ethnic identity, religious identity, things like that. So as I pull this up, this is kind of a review of stuff that we've all also talked about. After World War II, and there was a lot of sympathy for the Jewish population following the Holocaust and all the dirt that came out after the Nuremberg trials, if you remember, the United Nations, the new United Nations, talked about establishing a Jewish state, and it's going to be in Palestine. Now, if we go back in time, you remember that the diaspora of the Jewish population that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. This is where the Jews had their kingdom as told in your Old Testament, in the Torah, okay? And then what happened was that the Romans came in, destroyed the temple, scattered the Jewish population, and they lived all over Europe and all over different parts of the world. And there was a real desire to return, and that desire was known as Zionism. If you look at this down here, a lot of you remember this story. Zionism will not become a reality during World War I. There's a lot of talks about self-determination and all of that, and there are a lot of questions, what do we do with the Jews, okay, at that time? But there's not enough sympathy yet after World War I to create their own nation state. This is a reminder for you guys of the Balfour Declaration, where a British member of their government, the Foreign Secretary there, Arthur Balfour, makes a declaration that England will support an Israeli homeland, an Israel, if you will, as long as, and you look at the second highlighted part down here, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So the idea is The Jews should be able to go there, but the Palestinians already living there, most of which are Muslim, there are actually some Christian Palestinians too, but they're not supposed to lose any like rights or territory, identity, you know, as a result of this process. It's supposed to be kind of done fairly. Like I said, there's not enough momentum behind it yet after World War I, so it does not become a reality yet. Instead, the area around Palestine is held in trust, if you will, for the League of Nations, and Western powers kind of try to keep the peace there as best as they can. So this is all review as well. I just put it in there as review. You look at it, you know, Palestine, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it like all intersect here. These are all things that we kind of know already and we've already talked about, so I'm not going to spend much time on that slide. And here's the British mandate for Palestine after World War I. You can see it, and it was much larger than it is today. This gives you an idea, like, so the modern state of Jordan used to be called Transjordan, excuse me, and it used to be part of like the Palestine piece of the puzzle. You can see that not all of these modern states, as we understand them, are formed yet, okay? So after World War II, when there was all of that sympathy for the Jewish population, the United Nations decided we are going to create an Israeli state. Nobody else wanted the Jews, and we're going to put it right here in Palestine, and we're going to call it Israel, okay? And the original UN plan, when this is created in 1948, is that the land will be shared, and it will be a partition, again, a divided plan. So all the yellow areas in the original plan would be Arab areas the Palestinians could live in, and then the Jews would live alongside them in these other areas. And immediately, conflict started. Palestinians felt like they were being used as the bailout for what Europe had done to the Jewish population. If you look at this from the Palestinian point of view, they had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Not at all. The Holocaust was a European phenomenon. The Germans began it, and you know, many Eastern Europeans were complicit in it, and it was a terrible, horrible thing that killed millions of people. But these Palestinians that are living in what is now Israel, they didn't have anything to do with that. And here the UN, which is dominated by Western powers like Britain, the US, and France, are saying, well, we're going to put Jews where you live. And the Palestinians rejected that. They said, well, we're not going to take that. Why are we being used as the, you know, the guinea pigs for this experiment of yours? But ultimately, the UN won out, and Palestinians were essentially told to accept the plan or leave. And so the Palestinians resisted it, and war broke out in 1948, not only between Palestinians and Jews, but surrounding Arab states all decided that this, like this kind of Jewish thorn in their side that was being placed into the Middle East was something they needed to team up against to get rid of. And so in 1948, it's referred to by Israel as the Israeli War for Independence. Israel's will win because they're backed by the Western powers in the United States. I mean, none of the Arab surrounding mostly Muslim states, well, actually they are Muslim states, are not going to defeat the power, the combined power of the UN led by the United States. It's not going to happen. So with that power backing the Jews, Israel will be established, whether the surrounding Arab states like it or not. And the problem is Israel will immediately claim more land than it was supposed to. But they're going to say, hey, we won it fair and square in this first war. There are 2 more wars to come. So this gives you guys an idea of the change over time that takes place. You know, it was mostly Palestinian. Then you got this plan that puts the Israelis in there. As the Israelis conquered more land from the Palestinians, the Palestinian slice of that land gets smaller and smaller. And Israel, rightfully concerned about being surrounded by enemies, right, also took out its security issues on the Palestinian population, treating them very poorly, not giving them much status at all, forcing the Palestinians to live mostly in this region here, which is referred to as the West Bank, or down here, the Gaza Strip. These are poor areas. These are struggling areas, and the Israelis are pretty much excluding Palestinians from any elements of decision making and governing as the ruling power in the region. And so Palestinians often in this country go overlooked in terms of their struggles to maintain a voice and a sense of their culture in an area that for years the UN has basically said, okay, this is Israel now, we're going to side with the Jews for the most part, okay? So I told you a couple of wars were coming, and the second one is called the Six-Day War. This was a team effort by surrounding Arab states like Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, who all co-invaded Israel. They were going to co-invade Israel in 1967, but as the name suggests, the Israelis heard about the plan and they launched a preemptive strike against these countries and an invasion that resulted in the Jewish state of Israel not only winning that war, but gaining land that they weren't supposed to have, according to the UN, and then refusing to give it back. The Israelis are like, man, it's not our fault that there was this plot to team up against us and take our land. We won this war fair and square. We're not giving it back, right? That land included this Sinai Peninsula here between Israel and Egypt. Egypt took the lead, by the way, in this multi-nation invasion of Israel. And land was taken from Syria up here, the Golan Heights. The West Bank was secured by the Jewish state of Israel. And so they greatly increased their surface area, okay? Which is just going to lead to more conflicts between Israel and the surrounding nation states, these Arab states who don't want them there and now have lost land to them in 1967. So Israel gained all these things that I just got done telling you. Their goal for the Sinai Peninsula was for it to be a future buffer zone against Egypt, who they knew led this attack. But Israel's going to gain control of Jerusalem. And if you know anything today, that's not going to hold. All right. But they will gain control of that city, which is their holiest city. Palestinians given a choice of Israeli or Jordanian citizenship. To be honest with you, that's not going to last either. The Palestinians today are like the Jews of yesterday. They're an entire people group and culture without a country. The entire group of them are refugees, the way that the Jews used to be in places like Eastern Europe, because no modern Arab states really want to take the Palestinians in. Instead, they would rather funnel weapons and stuff to the Palestinians to fight the Jews for them, okay? And that way, the Palestinians today are a pawn in this dangerous and violent game between the Israelis and the surrounding Arab states that don't want the Israelis there to begin with. And so Palestinians are forced to endure heat on both sides of that. And it's just really a kind of a sad and difficult time for people that are Palestinians today. Another war, of course, breaks out not that long later, right? 6 years later, called the Yom Kippur War, launched on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. And again, Egypt takes the lead in attacking. And again, you've got Syria involved in this, and Jordan and Iraq support the conflict. And again, the Israelis win. But you got to remember, Israel's winning these wars because of the backing they have from the UN, particularly Britain and the United States. Britain and the United States have an interest in Israel. There's no oil in Israel, but there's a Judeo-Christian common heritage with the Israelis that people like Britain and the US don't share with Muslims. And so Israel just keeps getting backed by these dominant Western powers, so they keep winning. And they almost lost this one in 1973. It was some real much needed help that came late in this conflict from Western powers that allowed them to win. But after this fight, it became kind of obvious that Israel's here to stay. Like no matter how much the Arab surrounding states are going to team up to get rid of it, you're not going to be able to as long as Western powers back Israel. So during a process in the 70s that took place at Camp David, the Camp David Accords eventually gave, if you look at this map, the Sinai Peninsula was given back to, or like Egypt, like taken away from Israel. Israel backed away over time in a phased retreat from the Sinai Peninsula as part of a way to secure a peace deal with Egypt. To be honest, since the end of that war in 1973, Israel and Egypt have not fought an open war against each other. Now, Egypt funnels weapons quietly to Palestinian freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on what side of the argument you're on. So Egypt does funnel weapons to the Palestinians kind of on the sly, especially through the Gaza Strip here. But the open conflict between them is done. Enter the PLO, so the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as it was originally called. And this was a combo group. It was not that unlike, say, the African National Congress in South Africa or the Indian National Congress in India. You know, you see that it's got this Palestinian Liberation Organization made up of laborers and teachers and lawyers, but also people that want direct action through guerrilla warfare, right? There are elements of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they are exactly what they are. They want to liberate Palestine for the Palestinians. They felt like this is land we were on before we were shoved out of the way by the UN. We want it back. And there is a lot of like terrorist activity that went on by the PLO, you know, in terms of assassinations, in terms of, you know, suicide bombings and, you know, attacking Israeli infrastructure and buildings through sabotage. So that's all going on throughout the like 60s and 70s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So to give you an idea, I mean, there's a lot I'm skipping through here because of time, but since 67, you know, this has been an ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. You know, Israel, tired of these like terrorist attacks against them, they go into Lebanon really illegally. The UN and everybody was not happy with this. The United States is going to have to send troops as part of a peacekeeping effort in Lebanon, which is just north of Israel in the early 1980s. And we are going to take losses in this. And it's all about trying to like bring peace to the region that seems impossible. You know, the Israelis and the Palestinians are different religions. They have different views on whose land this rightfully is. Remember, even though the Israelis claim this like ancient biblical tie to this land, the Palestinians are like, yeah, that's great and all, but the Ottoman Empire controlled this land for hundreds of years. That's how we got here. So like to just take that away from us in a fell swoop is not good either. You know, and so they just got sides that can't see eye to eye on this and have difficulty sharing the land in a way that would be fair and equitable. So what happens is between 1987 and 93, the Palestinians launched what is known as an intifada, okay? And the word intifada means uprising. As people come out of the streets and they throw rocks and they, you know, take sniper shots at like Israeli troops, and it's an uprising that lasts for, as you can see, a long time, until a temporary agreement is reached to end kind of the fighting for a while in the early 90s. There are attempts in the early 2000s to come up with a settlement both sides can agree with, but you know, to have a two-state solution the same way you got with India and Pakistan. Let's just have a Israel and Palestinian state, but you know, extremists on both sides refuse to compromise on this. In fact, so extremist Muslims like, nope, all or nothing. These Jews are the infidels. We're going to fight them. We're going to die trying. But meanwhile, the Israelis are like, nope, this is our land. So they start moving and settling on purpose in the midst of Palestinian settlements, particularly on the West Bank. And so both sides are like poking each other in this process and fighting over it. And so by 2000, a second intifada or uprising is launched that lasts all the way into 2005 between the two groups. More extreme, more death, another proposal to try and achieve peace in the region. The Israelis pull out of the Gaza Strip, which I'll show you on a coming map here, and kind of giving that to Palestine. It's not much of a move on their part, because the Gaza Strip is a very poor area anyway. So give it to the Palestinians. It's almost like the same way the United States gave reservations to the Native Americans. Well, this is land we're not using, you live there. And that's kind of what ends up happening in Gaza. And you got these Palestinians like, wow, great, thanks a lot, By 2006, a new group kind of replaces the Palestinian Liberation Organization known as Hamas. And while Hamas absolutely was a terrorist organization, extremist organization that launched attacks against Israeli civilians in the forms of suicide bombings in theaters or buses or nightclubs, slowly but surely, Hamas also had a political side that was recognized as the voice that speaks for the Palestinians, okay? Extremist groups reject the right of Israel to even exist. So this becomes increasingly more impossible to figure out, okay? You see here, there's a Battle of Gaza. UN grants Palestine non-member status. So it's kind of a membership light in the United Nations, recognizing that the Palestinians are a country, but they're people without a country. They're like a physical country, right? Peace talks collapse. This has spanned many, many presidencies in the United States, by the way, who's tried to take the lead in the peace agreements here because we're the biggest backer of Israel. Nothing seems to work over time. You see violent acts on both sides. It's like violent reprisals. The most recently, the Israelis built a fence to separate themselves from Gaza. Was that remind you of, right? Build a wall. And there are violent attacks, like throwing bombs and stuff over the wall, shooting through it. It's just all kinds of bad stuff. So this just kind of gives you a sense of what Israel looks like today. And again, all these green areas are under Palestinian authority, but it's not their country per se. This is where Hezbollah organizes the Palestinians into a unified kind of force, but they're still living within Israeli territory, and it's kind of fenced off. It's the best way to think about it, I'm not kidding you, is to think about Native American reservations in the United States West, where these people groups are fenced off, and they're just and there's a lot of poverty there. There's a lack of the benefits you get from having your own place to live as a country, okay? So the Israelis kind of view this as we're hemming you into these human zoos. And that's where the Palestinians really resent this situation. And I can't say I blame them at all for that. So you got these two narratives, the Palestinian narrative, right? The fear of dispossession. They fear that all the land will be taken away from them at any given moment. And no other Arab states are willing to take them in. So it's constant fear of that. The fact that the Jews came late in the game in the 20th century, the occupation of them by the Jews that has lasted, several decades. And then the Palestinians feel they have a spiritual connection to the Holy Land, particularly through Jerusalem there, which is an important site in Islam, where Muhammad made his trip into heaven. Okay, so they're really, really important to them. But on the Jewish side of things, they're like, hey, we've been persecuted since the Roman Empire, the diaspora, we went through a Holocaust. And then this is our safe haven. This is our returning to our biblical homeland, going back, in the Torah, all the way back in the Old Testament. So that's their connection. These two sides cannot seem to come together on this issue. And Western powers intervening on either of their behalf have not been able to come to a solution either. The two are still divided. So with this, I want you to look at the embedded video I gave you on the the Israeli-Arab situation today. Then there's another embedded video that discusses the new Cold War that's ongoing in the Middle East between the major states of Iran and Saudi Arabia. So in addition to this fight between Israel and Palestine, Jews and Muslims, which is an old fight, you've got a new fight that has emerged over the last several decades between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. The Shias, of course, mainly live in Iran, but not exclusively. And the Sunni population is Saudi Arabia and, to be honest with you, most of the world. So these two major powers are today fighting for control in that region. And they're using all the other smaller powers in the region as a proxy to fight each other. And it's just an increasingly dangerous situation. Recently, the civil war in Syria has become a flashpoint for it. But watch this to give you a sense of how Western powers helped create this situation, okay? And then after they left with decolonization after World War II, the West has also poked around in this area of the world, stoking these fires between these groups as well. So watch that video, answer the journal question that comes at the end of this module. Make sure you got them all so you could submit them to me on the 15th. I am going to hold a Zoom with you guys. I think it's the 17th. We have the 17th and 18th are kind of like enrichment days for you guys to like catch up on anything that needs to be turned in before the end of the year. I'm going to do a kind of an end of the school year Zoom with anybody that wants to attend to make sure you got all your stuff together and to say goodbye and see you next year. Okay, so thanks for listening, guys, as usual, and I'll see you then.